Now that we know what higher order functions are, let's actually create our own, just to demonstrate how they work. So in this lecture, we're going to create a function that accepts other functions as an input. But to start, let's write two very generic functions that do simple string transformations. So one I'm going to call one word, and this will simply replace all the spaces in a word. So string dot replace, and then we're going to select all the spaces, and remember, for that we need to use this regular expression with the G flag, and then replace them with simply an empty string. And then we also convert that to lowercase. Okay, so this function here would simply work anywhere in our code with any string, and it takes in one string and returns a new one without any spaces in it. Okay, let's create another one, upper first word, which also takes in a string. And so these two functions, they will later be the functions that we pass into another function. Okay, so we first need these. So as the name says, this function here will simply transform the first word of the input string to uppercase. So let's just first split the string, so by the empty string, and then we will take the result and destructure it into the first word and then all the other words, and then return a new array that we will join. So that's first to uppercase. And here I'm not explaining exactly how this all works, because we already talked about this stuff in the last video. So we spread the others then also in the array, and then we join. And so you see that everything that we learned before is actually pretty helpful. Again, as always, especially helpful is the spread operator and the destructuring assignment, like we use it here. Right? And here it's actually the rest pattern. All right. So we have these two generic functions, and now we can create our higher order function. And that function will be called a transformer. And this function will take in also a string, but as a second argument, it will take in a function. Okay? And therefore, this is a higher order function. So that's the definition that we learned about in the last video. So it takes in a function, and therefore it is a higher order function. And so now let's see how we would actually call this function. So that's how I like to do it many times. So let's say JavaScript is the best. And as a second argument, I will now pass in the upper first word function. And so basically what I want the transformer function now to do with this string is to transform the string using this function here. So this function that we created here in the beginning. All right. And once again, notice how we are only passing in the function value itself. So really just the value. We are not calling this function here. Okay. We are only passing it in, and it will be the transformer function calling this function. So let's actually do that. So we will simply log to the console transformed string, and then here goes our expression. And so this is where we will now call the function. Now inside of the transformer function, this upper word is now called fn, right? So that's the second parameter here. And so fn, and then with the passed in string. Okay. And when we see the result, this will make even more sense. Okay. Let's also log to the console the original string. And so that's just str. Okay. And I also want to show you something else. So let's log transformed by. And in the last video, I told you that functions even have methods, remember? And besides methods, functions can even have properties. And one of them is the name property. So again, we take fn, which is the function that this higher order transformer gets as an input. And then on that, we can read the name property. And so now let's see the result of this operation. And so let's take a look at our interesting output. So of course the original string looks familiar, but then the transformed string indeed was transformed just as we hoped it would. So the first word is now uppercase. And so that is of course the work of this function here. Finally, we can also see that it was transformed by upper first word. And so that's fn.name. So as the property says, it is really just the name of the function. And so this one here we can actually use on any function that we have in JavaScript. And now let's try the same here with our other function. So one word. And let's see the result. Let's give it some more space here. And so here is the second output. So the transformed string is now this one here, all in one word. And indeed, it was transformed by the one word function. So this one here, right? So let's recap. We're calling the transformer function here. And into that function, we are passing the callback function. And remember that we call these functions that we pass, so this one and this one, the callback functions. And that's because we do not call them ourselves, but instead we call JavaScript to basically tell them later. And in this case, calling them later happens right here. So it's the transformer function that will call these callback functions. And the callback functions in here are of course called fn. And so that's the name of the function in here that we then have to call. All right. And in fact, this is exactly the same idea that we already talked about using the addEventListener function, right? So let's say we had this very simple function, high5, which doesn't really do much except of logging something to the console. Let's just put an emoji here, this waving one. And so now let's say document.body.end event listener click and then this function. So never mind about this part here. We're going to learn later what this means. But what matters is the addEventListener. And so just like our transformer function, we pass in a callback function. Okay? And this callback function in this case is also called the event handler or the event listener, but that doesn't really matter. What matters is that conceptually, this here is the callback function, and this is the higher order function. So this one is just like our transformer function, and this one is just like the one word or upper first word. Okay, so it's just a callback function that JavaScript will call as soon as we click on the body. So you see, down there now, they appear. And so only then the callback is really called. And there are many, many other examples in the JavaScript language. And this concept of callback functions is used all the time in built-in JavaScript functions. So there are many, many more examples. For example, the forEach function that we call on arrays. So let's create an array here, Jonas, Martha, and Adam. And on that array, we can call something called the forEach method. And we will learn about this one in the next section, actually. And then again, we pass in a callback function into forEach. So let's again use high5. And so as I reload this now, then we get here these three wavings, okay? And that's because we have three elements in this array. And so as the name of the method says, for each of them, this callback will be called. And therefore we have 3 wavings here. But we will learn all about the for each method in the next section. What matters here is that once again, we use the concept of the callback function here. And so this is something really common in JavaScript. Let me just write that here. Callbacks all the time. And so let's now actually take a minute or two to understand why that is. Why are callback functions so much used in JavaScript, and why are they so helpful? Well, the first big advantage of this is that it makes it easy to split up our code into more reusable and interconnected parts. So that's exactly what we have here, right? We have all of this functionality here nicely split up into their own functions, and that itself is really helpful. But there is a second and way more important advantage, which is the fact that callback functions allow us to create abstraction. So let me explain what that means. So what we did here in our code example was to create a level of abstraction. And abstraction is something really important in programming. So basically what abstraction means is that we hide the detail of some code implementation because we don't really care about all that detail. And this allows us to think about problems at a higher, more abstract level. And so that's why it's called an abstraction. So coming back to our example here, this transformer function does not care at all how the string is transformed. It doesn't care about this level of detail, okay? All it wants to do is to transform a string, but it doesn't care how it should do it. So what I mean is that we could have taken this code here and written it directly into transformer, or even this code here, right? That would have worked just the same. But instead, we abstracted this code away into other functions. So again, we created a new level of abstraction. And by doing this, our main transformer function here is really only concerned with transforming the input string itself. But no matter how that transforming itself actually works. So it's basically delegating the string transformation to the other lower level functions, which are these two. Okay? And I hope this makes sense for you. But we will also come back to this idea of abstraction later when we talk about object-oriented programming. But it's good for you to think and talk about this stuff as soon as possible so that you can start to get an idea for this really important concept of abstraction. And now with this idea of abstraction and higher levels and lower levels of abstraction, it makes sense that this kind of function here is called a higher order function, right? And again, that's basically because this function here operates at a higher level of abstraction, leaving the low level details to this low level functions. Okay? Now, they're not really called low order or low level functions, but that's just how I like to call them in this circumstance. All right. So understanding this is absolutely crucial for your process. And I actually consider this one of the most important lectures here of the course, because callback functions are really a vital part of the JavaScript language. And that's one of the main takeaways from this video. They allow us to create this kind of logic here. And so I think it's probably a good idea that you really review this really well and maybe even write your own example of something that you see in the real world using the same concept. Okay? I think that's a really good idea that you should try out. Then here in the built-in functions like add-event-listener and for each, these callback functions are so important and so useful because we use them to tell these functions what exactly they should do. For example, the add-event-listener function on its own would have no idea of what to do whenever the click event happens here, right? And so that's why we pass in the callback function here to tell the add-event-listener function exactly what to do. And as you already know, this is the higher order function here with the high level of abstraction, and this here is the function with the more lower level of abstraction. All right, but enough talk. Please take a minute to really review this lecture and build an example of your own maybe. And then I see you in the next video where we will basically do the opposite of this one. So having functions return other functions.